Hey everyone, we're live. I'm Mark,
I'm Crystal.
and
And
we're with Catherine.
Hello.
And uh, today, first of all, welcome to F4G Advocacy Media. You're watching Under the Surface, and today we're going to be unpacking um, a big topic, a serious topic, accountability.
yeah, I think it's an incredibly important topic. It's a difficult topic to approach, but I know no, there's a lot of stuff going on right now that certainly warrants accountability. And a lot of people are confused about it. And oftentimes are scared to approach it or discuss it. So thank you, Catherine, for joining us for this topic.
You're welcome. That was quite a lead in.
Mhm. Yeah, thanks for joining us. Um, you know, you're definitely at the top of our list because we of the kind of work you do and just the nature of it sort of breeds the necessity for accountability
Mhm.
on the part of your colleagues as well as
Mhm.
uh, other people around who are in that field.
Yeah.
Here we talk a lot about, it starts at the top, and directly what people see is how they treat other people. And so it's a very indicative to a lot of people and how they are treated and how they go about their lives and how they are affected all throughout their lives. And I know, Catherine, you work with a lot of people and see a lot of situations that can mirror that. So, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I think you make a good point, Crystal, about starting at the top. So, a big piece about accountability is also holding the people that you're working with accountable. If you're working with groups that are doing disability work, then you should be expecting to see people with disabilities as part of their work in leadership positions, coming up with innovative tools and techniques. So that's one aspect of accountability. Another aspect of accountability is also, a lot of times it's easy to kind of see how to hold everybody else accountable. And sometimes it's a little bit difficult to kind of see what our role is in all of that, too. And sometimes that requires us to kind of speak up and not be silent. And sometimes we may be the only person speaking up, which can be very awkward and uncomfortable. But that's what needs to happen in order for true accountability to exist. I know that, a big issue that I see in my work, which focuses on crime victims with disabilities, is funding, for example. So a lot of funding is given out to different organizations to do work with crime victims with disabilities. And some of those organizations do an excellent job. And some of those organizations, you just kind of wonder, where's the oversight? Where's the outcome measurements to really showcase that this money is being spent in a way that's actually benefiting the disability
Right.
community? So that's one aspect of accountability. Another piece that we deal with is a lot of times when organizations that are not disability led or really have a lot of representation of the disability community, when they get projects or funding for disability related topics, A lot of times they will work with local and community disability organizations, but not pay them fairly. So let's say they get like a $500,000 grant to do work in the deaf community, and they reach out to a deaf organization that essentially does all the work, creates the project and all of that. And they get paid $10,000, and there isn't any kind of acknowledgement of their work and that they're the ones that created that. And those are things that, accountability a lot of times also kind of partners with solidarity. And a lot of times for these things to be addressed, excuse me, we have to, when we see this kind of behavior and things occurring, even if it's not happening to us, we need to speak up against that, or we need to realize maybe that's not an organization that we want to partner with. Kind of like what you said, Crystal, it's not always, how people treat necessarily somebody individually in front of your face. It's kind of, the totality of how they treat a population or a group of people behind their backs. And a lot of times, being part of the disability community, we pick up on that. We see the little nuances. We really are very much aware when we're being tokenized. Yeah. And, that's one of those things where I think sometimes because we end up being so siloed into our different disabilities that we really forget how powerful we are as a community. And with that collaborative process and with us kind of coming together on certain issues, we really do have the power to hold people accountable. But it's one of those things where sometimes, you need to look at accountability as it relates directly to you. And sometimes you need to look at accountability as it relates to your community.
Exactly. But sometimes how you deal with other people treating you not right is often a reflection of other people's the way they treated you.
Right.
And so it's not, sure, the things that person does, you need to be accountable for. But oftentimes it goes back to not so much the person being accountable that is being blamed, but what led to that, And so, I think we also need to talk about, that's talking about, the enabling that we see.
Yeah.
And the people that are okay with those things happening, or they maybe know it's wrong, but they're going to turn a blind eye. Or can we also talk about that? It's very easy, especially in the disability community, for people to say, "Oh, their disability. This is because that's why they're doing this and this and this." So it must be their fault instead of, the actual person's fault that did something wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and within the disability community, and this exists in other communities a little bit differently, but with our community, when you're talking about, someone doing something to someone, again, my context is always going to be crime and victimization. And we have, a phenomenon in the disability community where the perpetrator and the victim can realistically be the exact same person. So you have some people who, are going to fit more of a traditional definition of victim, some people who are going to fit a more traditional definition of perpetrator. But then you have a lot of people who, for example, maybe never received any kind of sexual education. And the way that, somebody showed them love actually was a crime, and it was, abusive. And, but they never received any information to explain that to them. So when they go, start living out in the community or something like that, they just repeat what was done to them. And so that's more of, a victim perpetrator type of mentality. You see that a lot of times too in facilities. Especially I've spent a lot of time in child residential facilities, and a lot of times you'll have a lot of kids entering into mental health programs that have a long history of trauma. And a long history of really horrible things that should never happen to children, and they end up in these facilities. And a lot of times, you're going to have people who end up being picked on or bullied, and they start lashing out or behaving in a way that is going to be more aggressive, and that is more of a survival skill, but it also can fit the criteria for a perpetrator. So it's one of those things where you know most things, the older I get, the clearer it becomes that everyone really would like to have things be categorized in black and white.
Right.
But it really comes down to a lot of times that individual experience, and there's just so much more gray than anything else. And I think another piece that you were speaking about, Crystal, is with people not being treated correctly. A lot of that comes from historical stereotypes. And so that's some of the stuff that we're still fighting against, those stigmas. I know, even language within the disability community. I mean, like a lot of times I can tell if someone's part of the community because they use the term peer instead of friend, and those things are just institutionalized language. Everyone else that, has a connection or a relationship with someone, that's a friend. But in an institution, you have a peer. Also, the lack of physical touch that a lot of people experience in the disability community, that, human beings have a natural instinct to want to have, someone touch them. And we're very, very sensory beings. But, in a lot of facilities, there are very, very strict parameters around that because of historical abuse and neglect. So there's a bunch of different things that kind of factor into this kind of accountability that you're speaking of. And a big part of that is still wrestling with a lot of antiquated terminology and stigmas that, have come from, the institutions that those of us that are living in the community, people still harbor that. And many people with disabilities still internalize that. And so those are the elements. The accountability piece too. A lot of times it's been my experience, people are afraid to speak out because, if they hold someone accountable, what does that mean for them? Does that mean that they're going to lose their housing? Does that mean that they're going to lose their staff? And those kind of things, especially right now with the staff shortage, you have, I know that there are people out there who are staying in situations that are unsafe and unhealthy because they know if they speak up and they lose their staff person, they're going to have to go back to an institution and won't be able to stay in the community. And so all of those things kind of intersect, and people really don't think about it when we talk about things like staffing shortages and housing and those kind of things. It all intersects into our high rate of victimization and, crimes being committed against people with disabilities, because you have someone who's in a position of power and control that are able to, essentially leverage that to make somebody be compliant or submissive. And so sometimes that accountability, people, a lot of times, people are like, well, I have nothing left to lose. But then when you really sit down and think about it, you don't want to get a notice that you have to find a new place to live. And there aren't a lot of safeguards for that. I live in Ohio, and I know that, providers here are able to issue a 30-day notice based upon whatever reasoning they have. And so those kind of what I like to think of as loopholes are really detrimental in holding people accountable, because, it really kind of takes that power and control away from the survivor and puts it back on a situation that may be really, harmful and maybe criminal. Yeah.
And uh, what what responsibility? Well, I guess we can use responsibility and accountability in kind of the same breath, but they're a little different, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
They go hand
Um,
in hand a lot.
right.
Yeah.
But
So
sorry,
no, you're
go
fine.
ahead, Council. Responsibility is sort of something that's given to you, and accountability is more of an internal thing, right?
I think the accountability, like I said, that can be two pronged. That can hold yourself accountable, or that can hold somebody else or accountable. So kind of the person who I don't want to say necessarily is to blame, but somebody who has a role in that. The responsibility is really really similar to that, in that it's kind of, well, who does this fall on? Who is that person? And it's kind of the same concept, like, when we talk about justice in the disability community, that can look really different for different people. So, right now, people with disabilities have a really high victimization rate, 4 times more than people without disabilities. Of the cases that actually go to a grand jury and are prosecuted, it's only 22% of that, which is pretty appalling. And from that 22%, 9% are actually convicted, which is, again, appalling. That's from statistics from the Department of Justice. And so, for a lot of people, you watch on TV, like, let's say, Special Victims Unit, and you see Olivia Benson and the whole process, and you feel like you have a little bit of an idea of what's going to happen and what to expect.
No.
No, but it's not real. The other thing is, cases don't wrap up in an hour either. And so it's one of those things where sometimes, for someone with a disability, being able to be interviewed, if they've been labeled nonverbal, or if law enforcement has said, look, we can't interview this person because of their disability, finding somebody, a forensic interviewer, someone who's able to interview them, for them to even be able to tell what happened, that can be justice for somebody. For someone to actually be reported, and for them to take that step forward to try to hold them accountable, that may be some sort of justice for that person. Now, is that really the justice that anybody deserves? No. But unfortunately, justice looks very, very different for the disability community. And so, the element is it's important to hold people accountable and responsible, but it's also important to support each other. And so when we're holding people accountable, or we're trying to place responsibility on somebody, it's not just one voice. It's a whole community of people, because it can be really ostracizing and really scary just to experience any kind of trauma, and then trying to go through the system and then hold people accountable. It really can be a very, very lonely process. And so, this is an area where historically the disability community does okay with accountability in the areas of employment and transportation, community integration, education. Not that we are able to hold everyone accountable that needs to be, and it's an ongoing struggle. But historically, I mean, that if it wasn't for Olmsted, people with disabilities would still be confined to institutions. So we are really, really good of knowing how to use the system, of knowing what our resources are, and of coming together on certain topics. But I think that whole victim and criminal justice is one where we need a much more united voice, to be able to really hold people accountable at a level that we need to, in order to make sure that systemic change happens.
Right. And like I was referring to a little while ago, a lot of that stuff happens and is may there. It's okay that that happened to the disabled person because they're disabled, and it was probably their fault. They didn't know what they were doing, and so they. But anyway, I also wanted to talk about the different tactics. Sorry, the different tactics you've seen when people have used manipulation and gaslighting to to prove a point of what they're what they sorry what they think that the outcome should be.
Mm-hmm. So the manipulating and gaslighting, that unfortunately usually occurs whenever a crime happens with someone with a disability. You have everyone that wants to speak for that person, everybody that knows what's best for the person. And then you also sometimes can have the other side of it where, and you see this much more in institutions sometimes, where if something happens on one shift, the expectation is that, you should be over it by the second shift because no one wants to hear about it anymore. And so, the whole thing with the manipulation and the gaslighting, I think the biggest thing is really just the lack of respect a lot of times that ends up just occurring. If as soon as they know that someone has a disability, it's one of those things where, a lot of times that person isn't spoken to directly. It will be like the staff person, or, whoever else is there. A ton of times throughout the years, I've seen situations where, for example, if an incident happens on a bus, a transportation bus, that, my first question is, well, what did the witnesses say? And they said, well, we don't have witnesses. And I said, so no one else rides on the bus? And they're like, oh yeah, there's like 20 people on the bus, but they all have disabilities. And I said, and you have 20 witnesses. So they all need to be interviewed. So a lot of that, gaslighting too also comes down to even interviewing, as far as asking leading questions, because people feel like they're helping that person with the disability, get to where they need to be to disclose or whatever, along those lines. Unfortunately, a lot of that gaslighting and manipulation when it comes to and just general lack of awareness sometimes of disability culture,
Right. Yeah.
and what people are capable of doing. It's I think that's the biggest thing, is when you are outside of the disability community, the first thing that somebody looks at is the disability. And the issue is that, yes, that's a part of you, but when it comes down to most things, that's not really the most important part. Like, if somebody is victimized, I'm not going to sit down with a survivor who has cerebral palsy and talk to them about how cerebral palsy is affecting their lives. No, I don't care. I'm more focused on what happened. How can I support you? What do you need? Which you would do with any other survivor. But a lot of times, when you deal within the disability community, everything gets attributed to a disability. I was asked once to do a courtesy interview at a child advocacy center for a child who was a victim of a crime. And they were giving me information about the case. And they said, this child has really significant communication disabilities. And I was like, okay, tell me what the child can do. What are the things that they like to talk about? And then finally it got to the point where it was like, okay, so what's the disability? They're like Down syndrome. I said, okay. And what's the communication disability? And they said Down syndrome. And, we know that Down syndrome by itself is not a communication disability, but
Right.
people outside of the disability community, obviously not everyone is aware of that. So it was one of those things where, we did the interview, and what ended up happening is the child, we went right in, the child started talking. It was a great interview. And we found out right away, the issue is the child was like, the first forensic interviewer came in and talked to me like I was stupid, and I'm not stupid. So I didn't like her and I don't want to talk to her, which kind of makes sense. But, nobody takes into account the reason why someone with a disability may not be talking to you is because they don't like you. It's automatically because, they have a disability that's stopping them from talking to me. No, they just might not like you. And so a lot of those things end up kind of going on. And another thing with the whole gaslighting and manipulation that I've personally seen is having to literally advocate with prosecutors and law enforcement who don't believe the person's disabled enough. A lot of times involving, I had a case a long time ago involving a young girl. It was a sexual abuse case, and they, the investigators thought that she was able to provide consent because she didn't look disabled. And, outside of the fact that it wasn't even necessarily a consent case, I mean, the perpetrator had threatened to kill her animals and all that. I mean, like, there were real significant reasons that why it was not just solely a consent case, but those kind of things happen, all the time. It's like, oh, well, you don't look disabled. You have to kind of prove to me that you're disabled enough to get that accommodation, or disabled enough for us to look at this like, there was a crime that occurred. I know what also sometimes happens with individuals that are labeled as behavioral. There was a case a while ago that was actually received some media attention, where this young man had a multitude of different disabilities, including autism. And he was restrained on his bed in his bedroom by a staff person. And there was a video of it. And the staff person literally falls asleep with a blanket wrapped around this young man's neck. And he was murdered, and he died. And they didn't press charges against the staff because they said the young man, because of all of the disabilities and because he was labeled behavioral, it was a mental culpability piece that, the staff didn't mean to do it. He was trying to protect himself. So even cases where you have evidence, like ample, you literally have a video of
Right.
he murdered. It's sometimes not enough because of people's beliefs in, what the limitations of disability are, and, how people should be held accountable. Because it wasn't really that long ago. I mean, you can go to any kind of psychiatric hospital and see, just go into the graveyards and see, the infant babies without names. And, if you look back through the records, the amount of people who died from cerebral hemorrhages. I mean, this kind of abuse happened when people were in those facilities. So this isn't anything new, and no one was really held accountable because it was like, oh, they have a disability. What do you expect us to do? And you see that a lot of times with the cases that have gotten a lot of attention, involving police brutality too. A lot of times you're going to, find out later that that person actually had some sort of disability. And so, those are all elements that, kind of factor into the end result, which, in that particular case, 50% of all law enforcement shootings that end in death involve someone with a disability. That's a big problem. And with all of our intersections, you can really see how that's highlighted in a lot of these cases that get a lot of media attention. And this is not just one community's problem. This is a disability community problem. And this is really a local and global community problem because we all intersect into everybody. But it's definitely something where we need to, as a community, be much more vocal because, we have to stand up for each other, and we have to be able to take positions that sometimes are uncomfortable because people did that for us. None of us would be here now, most likely, if it wasn't for those people that spoke up back in the day, who, leveraged those suits, who fought for our rights. And so, it's a lot of times people like to think of that as history. It's not history. That still is a responsibility that's on each of us.
Right. I wrote up a minute ago enabling, and so let's use that as a segue, because a lot of times the people that are seeing this stuff happen that you're alluding to, the manipulation and gaslighting, or not the ones that are guilty of doing that, but they're the ones turning a blind eye to it and being okay with those crimes happening.
I think part of the reason a lot of times you have people that are aware that these crimes are going on and are not necessarily reporting them, there's a bunch of different reasons. One of them can be job security. A lot of people don't have the funds to be able to just quit a job and find another one. And so they kind of, what I like to think is make a morally decisive decision that I feel like at some point in their life will kind of come full circle. But I think that enabling people to kind of commit crimes and not holding them accountable is really an ongoing issue. I think we also don't even really have a good idea of how widespread it is with all the advancements in technology and things like that. The amount of abuse and crimes occurring on the dark web involving people with disability is something that we just don't have a handle on, and we don't have any statistics on. And so it's one of those things where, holding people accountable is one step. But that's where that personal accountability comes in as well. If you're there and you see it and you do nothing, you're complicit.
Right.
In a lot of states too, there's that mandated reporting requirement. It's sometimes difficult to enforce that, and there really aren't always very strong repercussions for it. But that is something that sometimes is a recourse, as people can file for that. But I think the other thing with the whole enabling is, even outside of the people who are committing the crimes and the people that are enabling them, I kind of feel like our society in general is very enabling, even with the way we talk about people with disabilities. I hate the word vulnerable, and it's used all the time when we're talking about crime victims with disabilities. They're just so vulnerable, a vulnerable adult. You hear it all the time. And the issue is that people are not inherently vulnerable. These systems are not set up to protect them. These systems are not set up to empower them. And these systems are usually not set up to be accessed and to provide any kind of accountability or accommodation to be able to navigate through them. And so I think it all kind of comes down to, just again, when we focus on what is the value of someone with disabilities, how important is their life, is their trauma, and is their story.
Right.
And yeah.
If we can stop right there, when we talk about, being enabling and you having the security as a normal person as to opposed to a disability, the protections that are in place and to protect a normal person and someone else with a disability, they're not on the same playing field.
No.
At all.
No.
So, a lot of normal people are confused by, we're on the same playing field. You're just as safe as I am. No, we're not.
No. Well, and the other thing is that, and I think I've talked to you and Mark about this anyways, the whole concept of normal isn't real. When people are discussing what is normal and what is not, there isn't this magical normal person that anybody, really can kind of compare themselves to. I think people with disabilities are very, very useful for people without disabilities to feel better about themselves, to feel empowered, to feel like, oh, I can take care of them. Oh my gosh. Someone with a disability has been a victim of crime. There's no way that they can defend themselves.
Gaslighting, though.
Yeah. Oh yeah. But it's also like, but here's the accountability piece. How many self-defense classes are the advocacy groups putting on for people with disabilities? How many empowerment kind of support groups are out there teaching the disability community how to navigate the victim services and the criminal justice system? How many, organizations are actually reaching out and trying to put people with disabilities in positions of leadership and in specialized areas instead of just tokenized as a self-advocate?
Right. And not just the physical tools either, in classes that teach those physical tools, but also the psychology of those things and how to deal with it emotionally.
Yeah.
And there's so many things that people don't even consider, or they don't want to discuss because it's taboo to talk about or whatever.
Mhm.
But
Well,
that is turning a blind eye
yeah.
to what's going on and the issues.
And I've been told, like, we're very, very careful about what we talk about around people with disabilities because it might upset them. Well, first off, they're adults. The population, that I primarily work with, we're dealing with adults. And my whole point is because a lot of times when especially in sexual education, you have two thoughts. You have some people most people, I like to think, that feel like people with disabilities should have access to sexual education, live, their lives in whatever way they choose. But then you have a group of people that are very, very adamant that people with disabilities should not have access to sexual education because as soon as you give people that information, they're just going to run out and have sex with everybody, which we know, from an educational standpoint, that's not true. But that's been something that I know has been discussed forever. But by making those decisions for the disability community, what ends up happening is you are essentially creating that vulnerability, because by not getting information about what is, safe sex, what is rape, what is, all of these different dynamics, people don't have the right terminology for body parts, and the perpetrators are very, very smart. A lot of times, it's one of those things where I've had cases where they've referred to different criminal sexual acts as just innocuous terms like McDonald's. And so if you're talking to somebody and you're like, has anybody ever, raped you or touched you inappropriately or whatever the word is, they'll say, well, somebody took me to McDonald's once. Well, nobody's going to make that connection necessarily unless it's someone who's trained. The forensic interviewing that we do, we would obviously ask additional questions to get them to explain that more. But I mean, that's the other element, is that, it's one of those things where withholding information and not empowering people can have really devastating consequences. And a lot of times people are doing that with good intentions, but not necessarily understanding the ramifications that this could hold for that person down the line.
Right. Right.
What's
Mark?
what other sort of enabling language have you heard?
Oh, I mean, pretty much the terminology is always a big one. Another thing is that, a lot of times that functional language, as person functions at the level of a 2-year-old or something like that, all that does is really just, is demeaning, kind of equating that person to a child, and pretty much saying, whatever you expect out of a 2-year-old is what you should expect out of this person, when in all actuality, you have no idea what to expect out of this person because you literally know nothing about them. One of the big, on the flip side, one of the more interesting things about enabling language is even recognizing it's enabling. I think enabling language is just common language for a lot of people when they interact with the disability community, and they don't even see it as enabling, or they don't really see the issue. A lot of people I hear, they're like, oh, people with disabilities can be victims of crime. Yeah, they're like, well, who would victimize a person with a disability? And so that's also, outside of that context, you have a lot of people that don't see people with disabilities as, individuals, or as people with different skill sets, or even people who may be sexual beings and living independent lives. And so I think the biggest concept with the disability community is that, there still is this idea of someone needing to come in and save us. And the issue is historically, when that has attempted to happen, it hasn't worked out the way I think that, the grand planners had envisioned. The only ones who are going to save us is ourselves. We can't really wait for someone else to come in and solve these problems or to deal with these issues. We're the ones that have to solve the problems and deal with the issues. And that's why I really appreciate, you guys even broaching this topic on your podcast, because, these are the uncomfortable conversations, but these are the conversations that if we don't have, we can't move forward. And we can't be honest about where we are as a community. So kudos to you and Mark for even having this podcast on this topic.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we get a lot of feedback from people saying, "Have you watched this?" And this is, and they're usually always. It's interesting because they're topics that are really tough to talk about, but they're usually people like at the top that are like, "Oh, this is interesting," and then they'll share it,
Mhm.
and then take notes on it, and it's interesting. But
Yeah.
so, yeah,
And
we appreciate you.
oh no, and I appreciate you, and I think you make a really good point about at the top. I think we also need to realize is that the disability community is like any other community. And we have our people that are considered the leaders within the community. You have, the people who kind of make a lot of the decisions and speak for the disability community. And some of them I agree with, and some of them I don't always agree with. But I think the problem is sometimes because we are it's instilled a lot of times if you have a disability that you kind of learn your place. And that you kind of stay in your box. And I think, a lot of times when people do reach levels of leadership, a lot of times we're a little bit apprehensive to speak out, not against them, but just from a different perspective. Because we don't always feel like our voice is as worthy or as important, or
Right.
We don't have the same level of education or the same type of experiences or the same networking connections. And the fact is that all of our voices are equally important. The only reason why certain people are in leadership positions is because we put them there. Their position is there because we support them, because we appreciate them. But I think a lot of times we don't really look at ourselves in those roles. And each of us have the ability to be change makers and to be leaders, and in whatever way we want to. But a lot of times I hear people say, well, I really want that statistic to change. People with disabilities are being victimized at a rate so much higher. And my response is, so what are you doing about it? And a lot of times people are like, well, like I live with a roommate and, I am working my job. I don't really have time to do anything. And I said, well, what about even like setting up, a book club with your friends and getting books and reading that about different topics within the disability community, supporting disability authors. Also, setting up potentially a support group, coming up with even, little packets. I know we occasionally, I don't think we did it last year, but around the holidays, a lot of times we do wish lists for some of the facilities here in Ohio, because a lot of times you have people living in there who maybe don't have an extended family. And so when it's Christmas or Thanksgiving, no one's coming for them and no one's getting them anything. And so even things like that. But I think that that's a big piece, is that we all can do something. And sometimes that can even be learning how to take care of yourself, learning how to practice. We don't talk about self-care very much in the disability community, and we should. We talk a lot about coping skills, especially that's a big thing I know within the mental health realm is what are your coping skills? Well, unfortunately, a lot of times people's coping skills are not going to be practical for every situation that they need to use it. Some people are like, well, I want my music and coming up with other types of coping skills, though that's really, really helpful. Learning that it's okay not to be okay, and understanding that trauma manifests itself differently for different people. And it's not because of your disability. It's going to be because of who you are and what you've experienced. And there's nothing wrong with that. And you're not alone. And I think that's the biggest problem that we have right now in the disability community when it comes to this victimization, the high rate of victimization, is that people really are not speaking out. They're not necessarily finding community in each other. And it's very, very isolating. And I think that that kind of helps continue this type of pattern by people not necessarily being those voices. And for some people, you know, that may be actually using their voice or their device or whatever. But for other people, it could be through music or through art or doing like a show. There's so many different things that people could potentially do, just at an individual level. But I think a lot of times, you know, we just don't see, you know, that ability within ourselves, and we all have it.
So,
And sorry, go ahead.
go ahead. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Um, Further to your point about disabled people generally being having lower education or not being being in positions where they can make decisions, and like in authority positions, um, that part of the factor has to be that they've been kept out of those roles traditionally, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Traditionally, I mean, you know, the one thing you can say about the disability community is that we have fought for everything that we have. And so, you know, that is usually you're not going to find people that are bending over backwards to put people with disabilities in leadership positions. It's something that, you know, you have to seek out or you have to kind of create yourself. But I do think, you know, that there is going to be more of a shift within the criminal justice and victim services.
I sure hope so. Oh my goodness.
I did. Well, we actually have just finalized our white paper where we're saying that that forensic interviewing with someone who specializes in disability is qualifying as an ADA accommodation. So, you know, that those kind of things, like for our organization, we're actively seeking out people to become forensic interviewers with disabilities, because it's one of those things where if you have that prerequisite background, which is, you know, you've done investigations and those kind of things, why are you not in those positions? Because, you know, the other thing is that within any community, there's some level of inherent trust if you're talking to someone that you feel like you have a connection to. Now, technically, can you find a connection with anyone if you really search hard enough? Yes. But, you know, for example, we're the only organization that has a forensic interviewer whose first language is ASL. And so that really, if you're talking about trauma responsive and those kind of things, this is definitely a way where you can have the deaf community having interviews and closed captioning for everybody else. So that's the other piece, is getting people from within the community who fit, you know, different kind of specialized positions, or even outside of that, to just even be leaders in the field as far as saying, look, this is what happened to me. This was my experience. You know, it's going to be traumatic and awful. I haven't talked to anyone with a disability who's gone through the criminal justice system and has been a victim of crime and has, you know, been so grateful that people are so accommodating and kind to them. So I feel like there's that case out there, and one day I'll find it. But even those kind of things, because there's just a lack of awareness. And for, you know, a lot of times I get, you know, questions from people who are like, look, I wasn't a victim or a survivor, but how do I support other people? Because I know they're out there, but like, you know, I don't know who they are. And the issue is that, you know, experiencing that level of trauma, you don't want to put people in positions where they're speaking about their individual journey, in a place where they're not ready to do so. And for some people, they're going to choose not to do that, and that is totally their choice.
Yeah.
But it's also one of those things to start having conversations. I know, and even having like topics on the subjects. For example, a big issue still within the disability community is, in instances of sexual assault where the survivor is a male and the perpetrator is a male, there's a lot of discussion about, well, that makes somebody gay. Well, that has been disproven, decades ago, but that is still something that people hold on to. That's also another way to manipulate people, is that if you say, I'm doing this to you, I'm going to tell everyone you're gay, or I'm going to tell everyone you're a lesbian. And so those kind of, stereotypes and those kind of things can be disproven. A lot of times people just don't know who to talk to get that information.
And I feel like that's a good, to go back to our conversation about responsibility and accountability. It's kind of like, if you accept the responsibility to be in that role to help this community, or anybody, whatever community it is, can you be accountable for those decisions that you make that's going to affect the rest of their lives?
Mm-hmm. And usually you're not. Usually there isn't going to be a level of accountability. And so it's one of those things where, we expect the courts to hold people accountable when they do something wrong. We expect other people. We do to do the right thing if they see somebody being mistreated, for them to speak up. But in all actuality, this doesn't happen, right? And so the issue is that, this is the same path we're going to have to take that we took with all the other areas that I've spoken about, like community integration, education. It's going to be lawsuits. It's going to be formal ADA complaints that showcase, look, the only reason why my case didn't move forward is because I have a disability, and that's discrimination. And the unfortunate thing is that should not be the case just across the board, because obviously discrimination is wrong. But when you're dealing with someone who has been traumatized and has experienced that level of, vulnerability, like I usually meet people on the worst day of their lives, and they're just fighting to hold it together. And a lot of times, what I say is, they're like, I just don't know how I'm going to get to tomorrow. Don't worry about tomorrow. Let's just get by minute by minute. So, let's start small and go from there. And to also put this huge burden as far as, not only have you survived this horribly traumatic event, but now you have to literally fight everyone within this system to be recognized, to be respected, and for your case to go forward. And honestly, chances are it won't, no matter what the evidence is. And so, if you think about it from that standpoint, what we're doing right now is putting all the accountability, all the response, or to hold someone accountable, put all the responsibility. We're putting all this stuff on the survivors. And it's like, that's not fair for any survivor of a crime to have to
what kind of justice system is that?
Right. But that's how the justice system is. And that's why I'm saying, as a community, we can't just keep on placing this responsibility on the backs of the survivors with disabilities.
We're not the ones being paid.
Right. Well, but I mean, we have to, as a community, start standing up and saying, look, we need awareness around this topic. We need, programming. We need accessibility. We need change.
Right. And going back to the enabling thing, that right there, that conversation right there is saying, okay, these things have been happening, and people have enabled it to happen, even though they know that they have to go through all this.
Yeah. And then you have, the other thing is, especially people who have been repeatedly victimized, a lot of times people get to the point where they stop reporting because they know what's going to happen. They know that nothing's going to happen, that there's not going to be any kind of accountability. And so all it does is create this vicious cycle that remains uninterrupted. And, for decades, the outside community, outside of the disability community, has tried to break this cycle, and they're not able to do it so far. There may have, like I said, been success stories here and there, but the only way that you can break a vicious cycle within a culture or within a community is by utilizing that culture and that community. And so it's one of those things, like I said, a big thing is just awareness. Another thing is we need to stop stigmatizing people who are seen as either victims or survivors, whatever term they want, and recognize, look, they should not have to fight everybody to get justice. And we can do some of that fighting ourselves in our own way.
Well, first of all, thanks for stepping up and trying to put that bit of legislation through that gets these forensic interviewers for
Very,
disabled
very
people.
valuable.
Yeah, it is going to be kind of a game changer. It's not a solution. It's probably a really small step in the whole journey towards equity. But
somewhere,
what it does is kind of take the power and control away from everybody else and allow that person to be able to be in a safe place, to be able to explain what happened to them in whatever way they choose. And, for some people, that's going to be a disclosure of abuse. For other people, it may not be. It may just be sitting there and listening for a period of time. But at least we're going to ensure that they're not going to be re-victimized and re-traumatized by that particular process. And because it will be part of the chain of custody, because if it's a true forensic interview, it would be videotaped. So that means it could be potentially admissible in a court of law. So that piece is going to be very, very helpful. But it's one piece of the puzzle. And so, that's why it's kind of like we need all of the other innovators and activists and advocates within the disability community to kind of say, okay, this is an area where we really need a lot of focus. So I'm going to step into it and do some work in this area, because we will accept everyone who's willing to do work in this area, because there is so much work that needs to be done.
right?
Also, we watched few videos and things before. People who are perpetrators oftentimes will have gone through trauma themselves, like being victimized. Where does accountability fit into that equation of, let's say they come in as a survivor or victim and they're not listened to, they're not supported, they're not interviewed properly? Who holds the responsibility for them potentially becoming a perpetrator?
Currently, the responsibility gets put back on them. And that is not what should happen, but that is what happens. And so that's why, like I said, it is a small step, but the forensic interviewing especially for adults with someone who specializes in disabilities, hopefully will be a step to be able to give people that platform to be able to report and to be able to be heard. But what you discuss, Mark, is a huge issue within the disability community. Those individuals that kind of would fall under victim and perp, and the perpetrator side literally is as a result of the victimization. And right now, our victim service system is not really set up to to really be able to support that person. I know that there actually are a lot of victim service agencies that won't work with someone who has any history of being a perpetrator, and they have very valid reasons. But I think that's where I'm saying, there's that nuance within the disability community where, yes, we have people that, fit that traditional view of victim or survivor, others that fit the traditional view of perpetrator, but you have a lot of people who fall into that victim perp. And sometimes, that perpetrating action is not necessarily something that's done with intention or something that's done to be hurtful. It has more to do with pretty much repeating abuse that has been done to them, or the withholding of education and knowledge and those kind of things. But right now, our criminal justice system is not really set up to be able to support those individuals. What's going to, for the most part, end up happening is that they'll be charged.
So, Mark, do you want to bring up the last topic?
Oh, yeah. I guess so. One of the tactics that people in power may use is of distracting from the actual issue and the actual thing that's going on. And what has your experience been in I guess, in the disability justice world?
So distraction tactics can look like a lot of different things. One of the things that is not helpful is the age that we live in, and our obsession with technology. People literally seem to have a 15-minute attention span. Other
Look, squirrel.
Yeah, I mean, and that's relative to both people with disabilities and without disabilities.
Yeah.
And so you're dealing with all of this distraction coming from all these different areas. What a lot of times that I've seen in my little slice of the world is when evidence is presented that shows that something is really a systemic problem. People in positions of authority really try to focus on how can we clean this up quickly? How can we resolve this quickly to make it go away? I think the biggest piece of the distraction tactics really is just the way that disability currently exists in our systems. For example, they like we're all siloed up into different disabilities. So it's like, if the autism community decides to focus on one issue, a lot of times you're going to have other like mental health or deafblind community doing something different. And we distract from ourselves a lot of times because we silo ourselves. One of the distraction tactics also is with funding. Instead of, a lot of times figuring out, what kind of programs and things to implement, it's also that balance between toolkits and white papers. Those are helpful, but you also need some boots on the ground. But a lot of times, people are more interested in, things that look pretty. And the other piece, when you're talking about distraction tactics, it's really easy to do because most people don't like talking about abuse and neglect and accountability and responsibility. So it doesn't really take a lot to distract, because most people are more than willing to continue along that way. I think the bigger issue is, how do you keep the focus on the topic? How do you get people to actually, because I was talking to someone yesterday, a potential funder, and I said, I really just don't like small talk anyways. I said, but I can't even begin to explain how frustrating it is. All the conversations I have to have with people to get them to understand and care about the high rate of victimization against people with disabilities. Because some of these things just seem like, why do I have to spend time explaining to you that this is a problem?
And then also we discuss a lot too, topics like this
Mhm.
are uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And people are like, oh, thank goodness that is over. I feel so much better now.
Yeah.
So,
And they don't, because nothing, most things are never actually solved. They're just put on the back burner and it comes back around. And that's ironically, that's the reason why I started this organization initially, is that, I had spent most of my career doing investigations and advocating for survivors and victims. And, the response would be, it would be an appropriate response based upon the parameters, but it was just a band-aid. And you knew that this was going to happen again, or that, that there really weren't things in place that were going to make an impact. And so, from my skill set coming up with this forensic interviewing piece and working in that area, really was good, because that's stuff I'm knowledgeable about and that's stuff that I can do and I've done well. But it's also one of those things where, most people don't know what a forensic interview is. And if you talk to people from the mental health community, when you use the term forensic, it means something totally different than how we're applying it here. So I think some of the distraction tactics is, even the language that we have to even communicate with each other. I mean, restraint means something different in every single state agency sometimes, depending on your state. And even things like, language around, staff versus, the person who works for me. I mean, that you're not doing, that person literally works for you. But it's, people with disabilities, especially, whether it's facilities or whatever, are constantly being put in this position where you should be so very grateful for anything that you receive, for any kind of recognition, for any kind of attention on whatever you're going through, because, that's something they're doing for you, not necessarily because they realize that, like, that's literally what their job is. But it's really this whole caretaking method for the whole disability community. And the fact of the matter is, we don't necessarily need caretakers in that way. We're perfectly capable of doing that advocacy and addressing some of these issues on our own. I just think a lot of times people are intimidated and they don't know where to start. And they're afraid, and that's all valid. But I do think, having these topics and having these discussions,
yeah.
if nothing else, highlights the fact that people are not alone, that, really, statistically, if you're in a room full of people, there is probably someone else who is a victim of abuse and neglect in that room with you. And so, that's something that I think is really kind of taking away that shame and that stigma that we as a community, by not talking about this stuff, unintentionally have put on the backs of a lot of the survivors.
Right. Anything else, Mark?
No, I don't think so. Well, actually, I think the point you just made there is a common thing about, and we talked about this before, like, I think it was the episode about gratitude, where, you know um we there's this overwhelming sense, if it's said verbally or non-verbally, that we should just stop complaining and be
Yeah.
grateful for
Oh
everything.
yeah, I think a lot of people feel like, look, we have like a wheelchair ramp. What else do you want from us? And I've had people like, if the two accommodations that they offer is ASL and, large font. And it's like anything else that's asked is like this huge burden. And I think, we as a community sometimes internalize that, as far as, well, we're not going to really ask unless we really need it.
Yeah.
The problem is with that is that if we are supposed to have equal access, which we don't, but at least some sort of equity to access. And that is not someone doing us a favor. That's legally their obligation. There's this lovely thing called the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and it actually makes, different bodies of government, especially Title II, actually have to provide things in a reasonable and effective manner. And I think a lot of times when it comes down to words like accountability and responsibility, when you get denied those things, people just, are upset, but nothing really happens. I think people really, if nothing else, a takeaway that they can use from this podcast is you can get on the ADA website, or get on the United States Department of Justice, their ADA civil rights piece. You can file a formal ADA complaint. And that is really, really important, because when you do that, not only does that mean that potentially the DOJ may investigate it, but what it also means is that for the most of the time, it's going to help create a record. So that when, different organizations like our organization are trying to get data to showcase that this is an ongoing problem, that this is systemic, if we don't have that data to show that, we may know that, but we can't prove that. And I think that's one thing that the disability community can kind of take some additional steps in, is filing those ADA complaints. And people are like, oh, I don't know anything about that. How would I do that? Luckily, every single state has a federally mandated protection and advocacy agency. And those individuals should be able to either assist with filing that ADA complaint, or at least put you in touch with someone that can assist. And those are things, like I said, those are steps that we can do individually. But what that does is that one ADA complaint combined with, 100,000 will showcase the whole severity of this problem. So it's one of those things where people are like, well, nothing that I do can matter. No, what you do does matter. And you need to be able, even if, you were able to, get around the accommodation and work it out for yourself, the next person may not be able to do that. So even if you don't file it for yourself, file it for the person that's going to come after you, who maybe, is not able to file, or there are other extenuating circumstances. So those are things, like I said, that are available to us, that are free, that we can do on our own. And I think most people at some point in their lives have experienced some level of being denied an accommodation request that they know that they should have received. Or experience some level of discrimination that would fit into an ADA complaint. And those are things that you can access online. And like I said, there are agencies actually set up that could assist people with making sure that that's filed correctly.
So I actually, hold on, put the record. I actually took down some notes from something I had watched. And so as different distraction tactics that people use, especially not just in the courtroom, but also just in general.
Yeah.
They might have a bias of, or just right out say, well, they had a tough background, a tough backstory, so that justifies what they did to you, and it could be generational or cultural.
Right.
And then saying like they didn't mean it that way. They did that really didn't happen. That right there is invalidating your experience, right? And then exaggerating. And then them saying you're exaggerating and you just need to stick it out. That is, who cares what happened to you? You need to stay in there. And even though it's not a safe situation,
right,
or whatever, it's invalidating.
Yeah, and I think you bring up an excellent point as far as also depending on the disability. I know when I did investigations with child residential facilities, a lot of times, those youth, because of their disability in their past and because of allegations that were made, they were automatically discounted because they were labeled as liars. And honestly, especially when you're dealing with youth and young adults and even adults, if you're a perpetrator, you want to go after the person labeled as a liar because nobody's going to listen to them. And so it's one of those things where, a lot of those examples that you gave are, you hear them a lot of times being used just against survivors
Yeah.
of abuse, but it gets compounded with the disability because it's one of those things where, well, you didn't know any better, or you needed somebody to, so it's also like you get penalized for not speaking out. But if you had spoken out, there still wouldn't have necessarily been the response. So it's kind of double-sided. But I think what's interesting is when you're talking about things, and again, I'm looking at it more from a criminal matter. You have a lot of even celebrities and movies and things that highlight people's stories.
Yeah.
For example, I just read Viola Davis's autobiography, which was great. But in it, she speaks of childhood abuse and those kind of things. And so, you have figures that people know and are aware of that, are willing and strong enough to share their stories. And people can see themselves and reflections of themselves in that person and be like, look, this person has been through this horrible ordeal and they have survived. We don't have that same type of leadership. You don't have people necessarily without disabilities. And I mean without OUT, because some people have disabilities and are not necessarily going to be vocal that they have them. But, we don't have movies winning awards that highlight our plight and our struggle. Because for that to be done correctly, it would have to come from within the community, and the acting and all of that. So even when you're looking within society, we're not represented in these Lifetime movies sometimes, and definitely in the mainstream media, in anything other than a victim role. And I think that is also really important because those things really are internalized and affect people's psyche. But I think, if you look at the statistics and how high that rate of victimization is, it's one of those things where you just kind of feel like, there needs to be a platform for people to be able to see themselves in others. And so, I think that's one of the struggles too, is that we don't necessarily have people who are speaking out about their own experiences and things like that, which kind of intersects into that whole awareness piece. But then the problem also is speaking out. I like to call it trauma porn, is that a lot of times, you have people that just, it's never stops with the talking about the different trauma, and people kind of become tokenized for that. And it becomes kind of exploitative, and it's one of those things where, oh, look at the, poor disabled abused person. And it's like, no, instead of, look at Catherine, the woman executive director who is sharing a personal story, which is how it would be defined for anybody else if they didn't have a disability. So I think that's the big thing is when we talk about these topics, yeah, it intersects into other communities and cultures, but with us, there's always like 3 little dots after a statement and says, but if you have a disability, because that's what it comes down to.
Exactly.
Well, I think any other questions,
Oh,
Chris?
no, I'm done.
Yeah,
Thanks.
I
Sorry.
yeah, I think this was a great discussion that we had.
Yeah, poor Mark there. All the stuff that went on, and me having to get a new laptop and everything.
No, it's
we
yeah.
we we watched the stuff and took notes separately, but it was hard to get together and come up with everything.
But you persevered.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You persevered.
We
It came out lovely.
we man we managed to stay accountable and made sure it happened. Yeah.
But we appreciate you helping us do that as well.
Yeah, and as time goes on, any of these topics that you guys want to broach, I will always any of the uncomfortable ones I'll show up for, and hopefully we can add some other people to the panels because I think the big thing too is the more perspectives that we can get on this, the more holistic view we're going to be able to have of looking at this issue within more of a totality. Yeah.
Absolutely. Like I was telling Mark, it's it's apparent whenever we discuss we want to do a topic, and it's not a topic that is controversial. It's not a topic. It's a topic about with. It's not pointing fingers at anybody in particular. It's more about them, and it's more about their what they've done, and how I our last topic, it was what was it?
Purpose.
Purpose. Yeah. So of course, that was helping the disability community find their purpose, which is an incredibly important topic in itself. But it's often much harder to come on and join us to talk about things like this, because like I said, well, like we told you in the email, so many people right now are confused about how they could be accountable for something if they've been an enabler, where they're at. They're trying to bounce it out.
Yeah.
So not many people are going to be comfortable with talking about it.
I think that really is an important step. If we can't even talk about it, how do we do anything about it? So I think, utilizing your platform, I know that, a lot of your topics are, really kind of focus on that whole empowerment and strengthening of people. But I think this is also
not just the disability community. Right. That's a personality and human thing.
But it all intersects. Because the other piece is, think about how many additional people that you potentially could have interviewed for your Journeys podcast if they hadn't experienced some really extreme trauma, and their life hadn't gone in a different direction. And so, it's all interconnected because, they build upon each other. But the next time you're interested in potentially broaching a topic like this, I have a couple people I think may be interested in showing up and being part of the panel. So just definitely let me know. But again, I really appreciate you all talking about this because nobody has ever, I haven't seen anyone really talk about this topic, and it is so important, and it really will resonate with so many.
It's funny, we were trying to separately we were trying to do research and stuff, and there's plenty of stuff out there about accountability, there's plenty of stuff there about disability, but you'd be hard pressed to find anything about both topics together.
Yeah. Well, and the problem is too, is when people get into leadership positions, people sometimes get very careful about what they say, and that's important, and you need to be aware of what you say. But on the flip side, that doesn't mean that you become silent about the things that matter. And my background has been advocacy, And so, I'm used to sometimes being the only voice in the room. Um,
Right.
but we need those voices. And
Yeah.
so, like I said, just even being able to talk about this topic and any of the future ones that you have,
Yes.
that within itself is definitely a step towards, even people being able to take the things that they're feeling inside and find words to be able to express them.
Right.
You just don't know the impact that those kind of things can have on individuals.
And we definitely need more people like you in positions to help.
Yeah, I don't know how many people would necessarily agree with that. I do think we need a
Well,
lot. I think we need a lot of the
yeah.
advocates that are out there to really hone in on, on this topic and to kind of do that whole go big and go home. Because I really think that this is something where, it's one of those things where there have been certain people that have been at the table for a while, and that's great in the disability community, and they have earned a right to be there. But somewhere along the way, people have forgotten that this is not a closed table. This is a table that should hold everyone. And so everyone should have a place there. We have all fought for it. We all have deserved it. And all of our voices are equally important. It's just we need to start utilizing that. And whether that's through a device or through a person or even through, like I said, artwork or something like that, it's one of those things where we are the ones that we've been waiting for. So, nobody else is coming. It's up to us.
Right. Right. Well, thank you. Get anything else, Mark?
Well, I don't want to keep us too long. So on the point you just brought up, Catherine, that everyone should have a right to be at the table, I think sometimes that point gets lost. Like it's sometimes can become an us versus them kind of mentality.
It does. It does. And I think the only way I think the thing is that everyone needs to understand and internalize you have a seat at the table. Now, whether or not you claim that seat, that's up to you. But you already have a seat there. There's a wonderful quote by Shirley Chisholm. She ran for president and she did a ton of work with civil rights and women's rights and Black rights. And it was, if something along the lines of if they won't give me a seat at the table, I'm going to bring my own folding chair. And but I mean, that's the way no one's going to invite us necessarily to take a seat. And the issue is that, this disability table is never ending and everyone has a place there. And it's not just reserved for certain people or for certain leaders. It's really something where you belong. There's a space for you. It just comes down to you claiming that. And that's something that, is people's own individual journeys. But, we are stronger together. And the only way that we're really going to be able to make systemic change is if more people stand up or move forward and say, look, I have a seat at this table and I'm sitting down.
Yeah. Well, it is getting late for us. So we really appreciate you being here, Catherine.
Yeah, always. Whenever you guys are talking about topics that make people uncomfortable, please feel free to call me because this is my happy place. So I appreciate you guys reaching out. And again, and I'm not just saying it, I really sincerely appreciate you guys broaching this topic because we need to talk about this stuff.
Definitely. There are so many different things that we could discuss.
Yep.
But
I have a feeling.
Time, I think, it has to be, when it's appropriate and when we feel safe to do it.
Right.
We might have to make another episode, accountability, the sequel.
I know. Right?
Like that?
Yeah, and I'll bring some of my friends along, so it will be a little lively. But no, I think, like you said, even if it's something where it's like a quarterly topic is more serious, or twice a year or something, I think I mean, I think that kind of comes down to accountability and responsibility. You guys have this platform, you have this podcast, you have people that tune in and that listen to you and respect what you have to say, and you're using this to actually educate people and to bring awareness to areas within our community that people tend to gloss over and just not focus on at all. So when you talk about accountability and responsibility, I think this is a really good example of how you can kind of take a step forward in your own way. You guys are really kind of showcasing that by even having this topic. So thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank you.
so much for joining us.
Oh, you're welcome.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.